Seattle Atheist Church, because good works in non-mysterious ways.
This talk is about a book. It's called Thinking in Systems. It is not the easiest thing to try to describe to people, and it is not the easiest thing to try to look up online if you're trying to understand some of these concepts. So I'm going to try to do a kind of a quick overview of the book and some of the ideas that are presented, and I will hopefully give you a few basic building blocks that you can use if you wanted to explore further. Um, and so, with that, let's kick it off. We're going to do a little introduction. I'm going to talk about a few of the basic components of systems, talk about a few surprises that you may encounter in systems, and then talk about a few traps and potential solutions to those traps. And what I mean by traps, or really what Donella Meadows means by traps, I'll get into as we get there. This is the book. It's called Thinking in Systems, a primer by Donella H. Meadows. Uh, it is a primer. It is introductory. It has a lot of basic ideas, and it is one of the best books that I've ever read, mostly because I'm particularly interested in the subject. So definitely recommend it. But in it, to begin with, the definition of a system is a set of things interconnected in such a way that they produce their own pattern of behavior over time. And that is pretty broad. It could mean that anything is a system. Anything can be a system. Like your body can be a system. Your body can be a system of systems where an individual cell may be thought of as a system, and then you are composed of a whole bunch of systems.
Mhm.
And it gets kind of complicated to think about, but it's kind of fun too. So I definitely encourage you to kind of think about instances where some of these components, as they come up, uh, might apply at different scales or different areas of your life in ways that you may not normally think about. Computer science is a very common search result. If you try to look up systems, there's a lot of results related to computer science, but this really does apply to just about anything. To get some idea of some intuitions related to systems, I just want to point out that you may already have some in mind, especially related to complex systems. And some of these ideas are frequently captured in traditional wisdom. So one of those ideas is that because of delays in complex systems, by the time a problem becomes apparent, it may be unnecessarily difficult to solve. And so how do you conceptualize that? What's the traditional wisdom? A stitch in time saves nine. The idea that if you make an early intervention and you make this small stitch just in time, then you won't have to do a whole lot more stitching to make a patch on this piece of clothing later. There's the idea of, according to the competitive exclusion principle, if a reinforcing feedback loop rewards the winner of a competition with the means to win further competitions, the result will be an elimination all but a few competitors. Okay, what's that mean? It basically comes down to the rich get rich and the poor get poorer. And that's a common thing to hear about. The idea is that if by being rich you're able to win, and then by winning, it gives you more opportunity to win in the future, then you get this feedback loop that makes it so that eventually the people who are winning are going to win everything or eliminate all but a very few competitors. line here, a diverse system with multiple pathways and redundancies is more stable and less vulnerable to external shock than a uniform system with little diversity. Okay, what does that mean? The idea is don't put all your eggs in one basket, which you've probably heard. So if you put all your eggs in one basket, that basket is very vulnerable. If you have any kind of external shock, like you trip, your eggs may fall everywhere and you lose them all, right? And it's this same idea. When you have multiple pathways, multiple resources, uh, then and increased diversity, then you're more likely to be able to survive uh, rare events or unusual events or large shocks to the system. So you probably have some basic intuitions already. These just give you some of the idea, but you can see how some of the when you start getting into the specific analysis of these systems, some of the language can be a little bit more difficult to follow. But that's where some of these traditional wisdom lines come in because uh, they take these complex topics and give you a nice clean story that is more relatable. Although not a lot of people that I know still do a lot of stitching. So maybe that one's less relatable to people. Uh, there are also some things to be cautious about. Uh, one thing to really think about is for those of us with some more scientific background, uh, we're usually trained to break things down into small, understandable pieces in order to try to understand them. But one part of that analysis is often overlooked. It's really common to miss this critical requirement that if you're breaking something down and you're analyzing one small component of a problem in isolation, like only change one thing at a time. You'll hear a lot in doing scientific analysis of something. If you're doing that, this thing that you're analyzing has to be independent of the other components for that to work. So if you are adjusting something that is dependent on other factors and you adjust it until you get the best possible result, and then you try to change these other things, you may end up with a situation where it's not the best overall possible solution. You can run into something that's called a local optima. So it's locally good, uh, but if you shifted things a little bit differently, you end up with something that's maybe even better. And it's kind of hard to check sometimes if something is independent. And don't worry too much if you don't have a good relationship with that idea. Uh, there's a Sufi teaching story from the book, uh, and the idea is you think that because you understand one, that you must therefore understand two, because one and one make two. But you forget that you must also understand and, and can be difficult. So one of the things to think about here is that a system can be more than the sum of its parts. All right. Hopefully that makes sense and you're still with me. So let's get into a few of these basic components of systems. So this is about a kind of a meta-analysis. This is about thinking about systems a step removed so that you can try to analyze them a little bit and understand what their impacts are, how they change over time. So the first most basic building block is stock. This is this is the memory of a system and it changes over time. So I have this yellow box here and that represents the stock. And the stock has inflow and it also has outflow. As you add inflow to it, it adds to the stock, and outflow decreases the stock. Uh, and so you can make adjustments to the stock. You might think about like a pond. So a pond is a stock. It's a kind of stock. It's a stock of water. And you might have rain come in, and rain is an inflow to the pond, and the pond will increase its stock of water when you have rain coming down into it. But maybe there's a little stream that comes out of the pond. That stream is an outflow, and as the outflow progresses, the amount of water in the stock in the pond may decrease until potentially you have no water left in the pond. Uh, these stocks can act as kind of a shock absorber. They usually change fairly slowly over time. And so if you think of a pond as like the stock of water, they can kind of act as a memory of all the things that have happened to that system over time. You have rain coming in, you have water streaming out, and that pond generally is going to be fairly stable relative to the rain coming in. So if you have like 50 liters of water in your tiny little pond and you add rain and it adds another 10 liters, that's only a 20% increase in the amount of water in your pond, even though it was a whole lot of water all at once. And then for a long time, for the next 5 days, you have 2 liters a day go out of the stream. That's a very slow outflow. And so over the course of a total of 5 days, you end up with the same amount of stock that you had before, but it's more slow, it's more gradual. And so that's kind of this idea of this memory of all those changes that have happened over time. Uh, Stocks allow for some independence in the inflows and outflows. So if you have a stream that is entirely dependent on rainfall, and it's raining, it's raining, it's raining, and that's all of the water that is going in this stream, if the rain stops, the outflow stops. There's no more outflow. But having that stock in the middle, having that pond in the middle, means that your outflow can be independent. You can have rain and then you could have nothing for several days, but you could still have some outflow out of this pond because there's still water in there for some period of time. So that's the basic idea of a stock. Next one we're going to talk about is feedback. And a lot of people have heard about feedback. Uh, it is particularly important to systems analysis. It's one of the most basic ideas, uh, and feedback is really centered around dynamic systems rather than static ones. So a static system has no inflow, has no outflow. It's just the way it is at that moment. And that is not representative of systems in the real world. Real world systems have a time component. They're dynamic. They change over time. And feedback is part of that mechanism. They can allow behaviors to persist over time. So if you have a behavior that causes you uh, to make something easier, then you're more likely to do that thing. You get a little bit of a feedback loop. They can stabilize, reinforce, but they can also destabilize. Uh, so uh, if you have a feedback in a system, and I'll show an example here later, uh, it can cause a wild swing. So that think about swinging on a swing set. Once you get going, you only have to swing your legs a little bit to keep going on that swing set. You don't have to put a ton of energy. You just have to put the energy in at the right time. If you put the energy in at the wrong time, it'll actually slow you down. But if you put the energy in at the right time, you'll accelerate. Even though you're not adding a whole lot of energy to the system, you are swinging harder and harder just because of the timing of that extra energy. And that would be an example of kind of this feedback to an inflow of energy to the system. Um, let's see. Yeah, I have a quote in here. Uh, it's important to remember that a system can cause its own behavior. It's not about who to blame, but rather where to adjust. So where do you make those changes in your system? Like where do you add that extra energy to your swing? The next idea is exponential growth. And there'll be more examples here later. But exponential growth is surprisingly fast, very surprisingly fast. And we'll get into why that's potentially a challenge or an issue later. But especially at the beginning, it may look like you are growing linearly in a nice line. So if you look at the bottom left of this little graph thing I drew, it looks like it's just growing nice and steady, and it's not increasing exponentially. But as you go along, you see this kind of elbow, and it swings up really fast. And that upswing can be shocking. It can cause a lot of issues, especially if you've been making predictions or making guesses about what things are going to do based on a linear system. If you're trying to like trace a line over the beginning of this graph and you look over to the right at where your line would be, it would be towards the bottom half. But when you look at the exponential line, it is all the way up at the top. And that can cause a lot of challenges. And a lot of real world systems have exponential growth. So it's something to definitely be cautious of. And next, we're going to talk about resources. This one came up in our discussion earlier. Uh, the key ideas here are that non-renewable resources are stock limited. So we talked about stock. Stock would be like a pond. If your pond has no additional inputs, or say it's a giant pool of oil, for example, has no extra inputs, it's not being renewed, then the amount that you have in that stock is what's going to limit what can come out of that system. So it is stock limited. There's no additional coming in. So depending on how much is in that stock, that's how much can come out. Renewable resources, on the other hand, are flow limited. And so you've seen I've drawn smaller arrows here. So this would be like a windmill. If a windmill or a solar panel, things that we commonly associate with renewable resources, but it can apply to a lot of other things. If you have some amount of wind hitting your windmill, that's going to be the limit on how much energy you're going to get out. Or if you have an area that's really sunny, you're going to get more energy out of that solar panel than if it's an area that's very cloudy. So the amount of inflow into that system, the amount of wind hitting the windmill or the amount of sun hitting the solar panel is going to be the thing that limits how much electricity comes out. You can complicate things a little bit, like you can add a battery in there, and that has the same kind of effect as this independence that I talked about earlier with the stock. So the battery becomes the stock. You can add electricity to your battery, so you have an inflow that's renewable, and then the battery is a stock and it holds on to that energy, and then the outflow is partially dependent on the stock and partially dependent on the inflow. And so you can kind of see how these basic building blocks get added to each other to create something that's a lot more complicated. And eventually it gets to the point where it's almost so complicated that you can't really analyze it. But we also have opportunities to kind of define the borders of our system. So I'll talk about that here in a bit. Uh, Next, I have this lovely picture uh, to talk about resilience. And so for those of us in the Pacific Northwest, this is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, famously referred to as Galloping Gertie. And this is a kind of a great example of how feedback, coming back to the swing problem I was talking about earlier, where you put your energy in that swing, can cause big issues. So resilience is about the ability of a system to survive or persist in a complex environment. So if you have a nice simple environment, like you just have a bridge, it's going over a body of water, uh, maybe cars drive on it, not a big deal. You know how much the cars weigh. You can get an idea of what the speed of the cars going over it is, and you can design your bridge so that it can survive all that. But this bridge wasn't in a simple environment, it was in a complex environment. And that complex environment included winds that hit at a certain frequency. And those winds hit kind of like swinging on a swing. And they kept hitting at just the right moment so that this bridge started swinging harder and harder. And it got to the point where the bridge said, uh, I wasn't really designed for this, being sideways thing. Plus, you got some cars on me and I weigh something. This isn't so great. And it started to break apart and eventually catastrophic failure and the whole bridge collapsed. It's a major lesson for a lot of civil engineers, especially to learn about this bridge and some of the issues, and encourages you to think about additional complexities that you might have in your environment. Uh, Systems need to be managed for productivity and stability and resilience. So for this bridge, you know, they thought that they were doing all three. They had productivity. Cars were going over it. It was great. Worked just fine for that. They thought it was pretty stable because the cars stayed on the bridge and the bridge stayed up. But it was not resilient to this complex environment. And so eventually it collapsed. And so it's something that was a bit of a surprise to a lot of people, and it caused a lot of thinking about what are some of these other complexities and systems that you need to think about. And so that leads us to system surprises. And so I have a couple of quotes here. One directly from the book. Everything we think we know about the world is a model. Our models do have strong congruence with the world. Our models fall far short of representing the real world fully. So we have an idea of what the world is like, but that's a model. And it does a good job. Like it helps us. Like we're able to process concepts, we're able to do things based on these models of how the world works. But they don't represent the world fully. They're not a perfect representation of the world. Another quote here from George Box. The concepts have been around for a long time, but the specific quote is attributed to George Box, who's a famous statistician. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And so the image here I pulled off the internet is a map that you might be familiar with. This light blue map is the map that you might have seen in your classrooms in school. And you see this gigantic landmass above the US. You see how huge Russia is. But if you were to look at it based on the actual true size, the true area of those countries, you would see that a lot of them are very exaggerated in size. And that's because of the specific model that was used to generate those maps. And so we've got this round planet, and so when you try to flatten it out to make it a nice two-dimensional map that you can hang on your wall, in order to do that, the Mercator projection stretches these land masses, especially if they're far north of the equator or far, far south. And so if you look at this map, you see that the countries that are centered around the equator don't change in size much. If you look at their actual landmass area compared to the Mercator projection. But as you get farther and farther north, especially, but also as you go south, you see a huge discrepancy, and that can be really surprising for people, uh, especially uh, especially people that look at like Canada and think, oh well, Canada is like way bigger than Brazil, for instance. And no, not really. When you look at the actual square footage, so definitely something to think about. What model you're using to represent the world. The next surprise we talked about earlier: linear minds in a non-linear world. We're very good at lines. We understand a line, straight line. Okay, here to there. Lines make sense. Exponential growth doesn't come naturally to us. Um, and another kind of concept that I want to toss in here is related to uh, the idea of what is a system. There are no separate systems. The whole world is a continuum of systems. Like everything is interconnected in some way. Okay, so what does that mean? What does that do for us? Um, you get to choose where you draw your boundaries. You can draw a boundary around the system depending on the purpose of the discussion, the questions that you want to ask. If you want to talk about the system of watering your plants, where you take water from your watering can and you pour it into the pot, and your plant absorbs some of the water and then uh, maybe drains a little bit into the overflow area, and some of it evaporates away. In order to talk about that system, you would potentially have to talk about: where'd that water from the watering can come from? Well, I turned on the tap. Where'd that water come from? Well, it came from the pipes. Where'd that come from? Well, the water tower, and so, and it gets extremely complicated. It involves the entire planet in this act of watering your plant, but it's not very useful for watering your plant. If the thing that you're concerned about is this plant getting enough water, then you can draw your boundary and say, okay, I'm concerned about the water in the watering can being poured into this this pot. And that's where you draw your system, and that's where you ask your questions. One example that they talk about is highway car speeds. So to imagine this one, this is this kind of exponential system versus a linear idea, except it's kind of upside down. So you think about car speeds and you think, okay, we're on a highway, everybody's moving about the same speed. Great. Uh, if we add another car to the system, you think, okay, maybe everybody goes a little bit slower. All right, we add another car. Maybe everybody goes just a little bit slower. But you think it's going to be pretty linear. If the more we add cars, the slower everybody goes. But what happens in a real world system is you add cars, and generally the speed stays pretty stable until you add too many cars. And then all of a sudden it plummets and drops down, and you get things like traffic jams. And the difference between everybody going about the same speed as they were before can be one car. That can be all the difference that it takes. Um, just a small further increase can cause a rapid change. Another example of this is like advertising. If you have a little bit of tasteful advertising, it can awaken interest in a product. You might become aware of a product that you didn't know existed. You might look at it and say, "Oh, that looks interesting. I kind of like it. I maybe want to buy it." But if you get a whole lot of blatant advertising, that can cause disgust for the product. You can go from being unaware to outright rejecting this product. And so this is kind of a surprising result sometimes. Like you don't necessarily know where that rapid change is going to happen because we're predicting this nice linear system, nice steady line, just a little bit more advertising, a little bit more advertising, and then all of a sudden huge plummet in interest and success. The next surprise is layers of limits. You see my graph gets a little more complicated. We have two stocks here. The first stock in yellow has two inflows, and it also has two outflows. The second stock has two inflows and one outflow. And we have several different feedback loops. One feedback loop going from the first stock into one of its inflows, one going from the second stock into one of its inflows, one going from the second stock into the first stock. You can get some weird complications as you start adding in layers. So if you uh, like say there's a limit on the outflow of the first stock. Maybe you have a fish tank and you put a pipe in it so that it can drain. And if you put a really small diameter pipe on it, it can't drain very quickly.
Mark, I can't hear you. I am not hearing you.
All right, can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you now.
All right, sorry about that. I think my headset died. No good. All right. So for this one, we talked about this tiny little pipe coming out of your fish tank. So that limit is going to be very important. That's going to limit how much water is going to flow out of your system. But what if you also have a little pipe that's feeding into this fish tank? And what if the diameter of that pipe is a little bit bigger? Okay, then the outflow is going to be dependent on that little bitty pipe. That's going to be the thing that is most limiting. But if you made it so that the input pipe is much smaller, then it doesn't matter if your outflow pipe is much bigger. Eventually, that fish tank is going to empty, and the thing that's most limiting is this inflow. And so your outflow is going to start to trickle, even though you have a big, outflow pipe available. It could flow more if you had more inflow. So you have these layers of limits. And anytime that you have a physical entity with multiple inputs and outputs, there's going to be these layers of limits. And there are always going to be limits to growth. They can be self-imposed, but if they aren't self-imposed, they will be system-imposed. Okay, so that's kind of complex. So what does that mean? So if you have, or like we'll go back to our pond example. If you have a pond and it has so much water in it and you have a stream going out of it, and you have a stream going into it, you could limit the amount of outflow. And a way that that's frequently done is with a dam. And so you might take a dam and you may turn the water flow out down. And so eventually your pond is going to fill up and maybe it becomes a lake even. And the thing that's limiting here is this self-imposed limit that you made on the outflow. But what if you don't self-impose that outflow? What if you open that up and you make this huge outflow so the water can just flow freely? That system is going to system impose a limit because you have a small stream coming in. Eventually your pond is going to drain completely, and that disconnect between your inflow and outflow that we talked about earlier, that is your stock, your pond, that system is going to run out. You are going to have a system imposed limit on how much outflow you can have. You can only have as much outflow as you have inflow in that case. So hopefully that helps clarify some of it, but definitely happy to discuss further. The next one here are ubiquitous delays. Delays happen. There are always delays. Delays come in lots of different forms, and I'm sure a lot of you have experience with all kinds of delays. But what we're going to think about here is long delays in feedback loops. So if you have a long delay in your feedback loop, you may only act when a problem becomes obvious, and you might miss an important opportunity to solve that problem. So this is where that a stitch in time saves 9 idea comes in. If you don't know that the hole in your pocket is going to cause all of your pocket equipment to fall out, if you don't notice it early enough, you may end up with a catastrophic failure. You may not get that feedback. That feedback may not come fast enough. There may be enough of a delay that the only indication that you have that your pocket is failing is when everything falls out of it, when it has failed catastrophically. Where if you were to have a little bit of foresight, have some kind of foresight to say, hey, this looks like it's getting a little weak. Maybe I'll patch it up a little bit. I'll add a stitch here to help reinforce it. Then maybe you don't have that catastrophic failure. And so these kind of feedback delays can cause a lot of problems. And they can be hard to tell, hard to identify. So we'll talk about that just a little bit more later. Next, we're going to talk about bounded rationality. So to help explain this one, I have this great meme. Dog sitting there, room's on fire, and he says, "This is fine." Well, maybe it is fine. Maybe let's think about this. We have this room, it's on fire. Clearly, it's not fine, right? That's considering this larger system. But what if we drew a tiny little box just around the dog and the table and the coffee cup? Don't include the smoke up top, don't include the fire around it, just this tiny little space. If that's the system that we're talking about, if we bound our system into this small box and it's just the dog sitting on the chair with the coffee cup, everything is fine. That might be okay. So bounded rationality is like that. It's this idea that each piece in a system may make decisions that make it so that the overall system fails or it's bad. So a rational actor. So this dog, maybe if their system, if all that they're aware of and all that they're thinking about is the chair and the coffee cup, everything's fine. But if you increase the bounds, if they were able to look outside of this small system, they might see that the decisions that they're making at that time are not great. They're not helping this overall system. They're causing actually problems. They're going to burn. And so you have to consider the boundaries of your system, and you have to recognize when your awareness or your rationality has hit its limits. Like, what are the things that you're not aware of? Unknown unknowns, which can be extremely hard to think about. You don't know that you don't know them. But perhaps there are things that you can do to help prepare for some of those possibilities. You may not know what the wind frequency is in the Tacoma Narrows, but if you allow for the possibility that there could be gusts of wind that hit the natural frequency of this bridge, maybe you design it a little bit differently. There's a bridge there now. It's different. It is designed to withstand these kinds of inputs to the system. Again, getting into some of the more complex kind of ideas, but hopefully that gives you a starting point. And so now we want to talk about traps. Traps are, we've kind of touched on some of the ideas of traps, but traps happen in times when you get surprised. Things that you don't expect in a system, and then they suddenly appear. And so to help explain this, I'm going to read just a chunk from the book. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, Western society has benefited from science, logic, and reductionism over intuition and holism. Psychologically and politically, we would much rather assume that the cause of a problem is out there rather than in here. It's almost irresistible to blame something or someone else, to shift responsibility away from ourselves, and to look for the control knob, the product, the pill, the technical fix that will make the problem go away. Serious problems have been solved by focusing on external agents. We've helped prevent smallpox. We've increased food production, moved large weights and many people over long distance. But because these are embedded in larger systems, some of our solutions have created further problems. And some problems, those most rooted in the internal structure of complex systems, the real messes, have refused to go away. Hunger, poverty, environmental degradation, economic instability, unemployment, chronic disease, drug addiction, war, for example, persist in spite of the analytical ability and technical brilliance that have been directed towards eradicating them. No one deliberately creates these problems. No one wants them to persist, but they persist nonetheless. And as an aside, this could be attributed in the same way to the previous talk that we had about Moloch. But that is because they are intrinsically systems problems. They are undesirable behaviors that are characteristics of the system structures that produce them. They will yield only as we reclaim our intuition, stop casting blame, see the system as the source of its own problems, and find the courage and wisdom to restructure it. It's kind of obvious, but subversive. It's an old way of seeing, but somehow new. Comforting in that the solutions are in our hands. Disturbing because we must do things, or at least see things and think about things in a different way. And so I have this little uh-oh here. We have to see that some problems are inherent to the systems they're a part of. And the uh-oh part is we have to do the work to adjust the system. We can't just fix this symptom. We have to adjust the system itself. And that can be a big challenge. So here are a few kind of quick traps. I'm going to try to go through these a little bit faster. Policy resistance. So if you have a lot of people that are pulling towards different goals, any new policy can drift further from the goals of some of those people. And that can create more resistance. And it's an undesirable state for anyone. People want to make improvements, but these new policies are increasing the amount of resistance. And so to fix this, you have to let go. The work you have to do is bringing everyone together, finding mutually acceptable paths to those goals. Next one is tragedy of the commons. So if every user benefits from a shared resource and the cost of abuse of that resource is also shared, then the resource is overused until it becomes unavailable. So the example of that is if you have a pasture, a common pasture, and you have a bunch of shepherds. And each shepherd looks at that common pasture and says, well, if I basically get this feeding for free, it's a shared resource. And if it gets abused, I only have to deal with a small portion of the abuse. So it's in my best interest as an individual shepherd to add another sheep, take advantage of the shared resource. But every single shepherd feels the same way. And so they keep adding sheep until all of a sudden this entire pasture is worthless and you get no value from it. So how do you avoid that? Education is a big factor on this one. And then it's also important to reinforce that missing feedback loop. So there's some kind of missing feedback loop there. And you need to find ways to impose that. And sometimes that's done through education, sometimes it's done through regulation, like there are other mechanisms involved there. Drift to low performance. If you have a standard that's based on previous performance and that previous performance wasn't very good, then it reinforces this lower performance level. Everybody's like, oh, well, we only have to perform this well. And then, oh, we only have to perform this well. If it's informed by the lowest level of performance, then you're going to see this drift to worse and worse performance. So instead, look at making your standards be influenced by the best actual performance of the system. Use that system feedback to your advantage. So then the standard becomes a little bit higher every time. Oh, we want to be just a little bit better. We want to be a little bit better. Use that system that already exists to your advantage. Escalation. So if you have two stocks and one stock's state depends on surpassing another, you get exponential growth or exponential decay, and things collapse very, very quickly. We've heard about escalation in things like weapons, in wars, that kind of thing, but they appear in lots of other places. The best thing to do is to avoid this to begin with. But if you do encounter it, refusing to compete or negotiating a new system that has balancing loops, some kind of feedback loop that keeps that escalation from happening, is going to be what you're going to try for. This one is definitely commonly encountered: success to the successful. If you win and your reward is something that helps you win again, eventually the winner is going to take all. So how do we avoid that? Diversification, having lots of different opportunities, lots of different things that you're trying to improve. Limitations on fraction of control. So things like antitrust laws, where you say, okay, yes, you've been winning, but that increases your chances of winning. And so you're only allowed to control 50% of this resource, or you're only allowed to control 25% or 75%, whatever it may be. Also add policies that create rewards that don't bias the next round. So make it so that the winner wins, but the thing that they win doesn't make it easier for them to win again. And that can be hard to think about, but also valuable. Shifting the burden to the intervener. So the solution to a problem helps the symptoms, but not the underlying problem. So if you have a system that's self-maintaining, but it gets eroded through this solution, then the system becomes even more dependent on the solution. So you need to avoid this. Think about things as a long-term rather than short-term relief. If you have, like if there's something that's causing chronic pain that you've been treating with a pain medication, but that helps it short-term, but it doesn't help a long-term issue, like maybe you need a surgery. Maybe thinking long-term, fixing that surgery can be the thing that you need to do, even though it may be challenging to think in that way. Rule beating. If you have a behavior that gives the appearance of obeying the rules or achieving goals, but it actually distorts the system. So it's like, oh yeah, I'm following the rules. I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. But it's a distortion of the system. It's a distortion of the actual goals. And so in that case, you have to redesign the rules. You have to find ways to make it so that your creative energy is spent achieving the purpose of the rules rather than beating the rules, which can be hard to do. A lot of the frustration around laws and lawyers comes down to rule beating. It's like, yeah, okay, technically the law says that you're right in this case, but that's not really the intent. And so then you get adjustments in the laws to try to capture that redesign of the rules. And that comes back to also seeking the wrong goal. So if you have a feedback loop, it can dominate your entire system's behavior. And your system may try very hard to reach an undesirable result. So you need to be very careful with your goal settings. You need to create goals that reflect the real welfare of the system and don't confuse effort with results. Ran a little bit long here, so if you want to have further discussion, definitely feel free to reach out. This is really just a basic overview of some of the ideas. And if you want to discuss further, definitely reach out on our Discord server, but I can also be reached via email or on Blue Sky. Thank you, everyone.